introduction to Paul in relation to the prairie. So Paul was gracious enough to come and give a wonderful talk about his recent conversion to Orthodoxy. A few months ago we had a wonderful time both at the talk, and then he had the wonderful insight to, like Paul, to have the gathering afterwards. We got to form these more meaningful relationships, saw people from America, Germany, all over Ireland, everything. So I appreciate Paul coming back and getting the chance to introduce these two guys in person, based on the relationships that we've been talking about that have been forming online with Jonathan Pajot, people like that. And I think Paul's work, what he's doing in the Substack, is on point with some of the key issues that Paul van der Klee is dealing with, those deep questions versus the kind of nihilistic underpinnings of modernity, things about creation, our role as Christians in caring for what people call the environment and all today. So I want to just delve into some of those. So with that in mind, I want to ask you, Paul, about this societal call, and individual call, of course, of ourselves as Christians to care for creation, and some ways, given your background, how does that contrast with the modern notion of environmentalism as it's become popular now? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming as well. Thank you for not leaving when you found the Capricorns weren't coming. Good to know. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know anything about me, I'm a writer, but I was also an environmental activist for a long time. I wrote for many years, and I still do really, about our relationship with nature and how broken it is. Which to me, I've come to see over many years is really a spiritual crisis rather than an economic or a political one. It's not really about carbon or wind farms or any of that stuff, or sustainability. It's really about the relationship we have with the rest of life. And so I was writing about that for many, many years. I suppose it developed from a young activist's mindset into a more, hopefully more mature spiritual search, which then led me very unexpectedly just a few years ago to become a Christian, sort of kicking and screaming in a way actually. I didn't expect to become a Christian, but God has a sense of humour, it turns out. So I ended up as an Orthodox Christian, which is, I'm now in the Orthodox Church, the Romanian Orthodox Church actually in Ireland. And it's been a long journey. I've been through my own sort of neo-pagan phase. I was a Zen Buddhist for a while, and I've ended up, as I say, in the Orthodox Church, which is the oldest Christian church, and it's maybe the most traditional, the most liturgical. So in a way, it seems like a place I would never have imagined I would end up in 5 years ago. Certainly not one that seems to have much to do with environmentalism, but actually, what I found in my coming back to Christianity, and I have a friend, Martin Shaw, who's a mythologist and a storyteller, and actually I'm doing an event here with him in November. And Martin also, sort of much to his own shock, become a Christian quite recently, and he said something, I think he might have said it in his podcast conversation with you actually. He said I didn't convert to Christianity, I just discovered I was always a Christian, which I quite like, and I sort of feel the same. I don't really like the notion of conversion. It's almost like an uncovering, it's an unveiling. It's like I actually realised that many of the things I believed were actually Christian things. That's how I saw the world. And then a sort of encounter with Christ kind of seals the deal. And at that point, there's no escape really. But the Orthodox Christian understanding of the world and the understanding of our relationship with nature is not what I thought or what I had been told the Christian relationship with nature is. So certainly from an Orthodox perspective, God is everywhere. He's in everything. He's transcendent as well as immanent, which means that God is woven through the creation. There's a lovely Orthodox prayer that you say quite a lot, the Trisagion prayer. I'll try and remember it. It says, Heavenly King, O Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who is in all places and fills all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain and save our souls. So the way that is worded is very beautiful. Firstly, all the different names for God, because you're always reaching towards this actually unknowable creative force. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who is in all places and fills all things. But that's the Orthodox perspective on God. And when you hear that, you realise that what you're seeing as creation, what you're seeing as nature is is not an inanimate collection of resources. Neither is it something to be worshipped, as say a neo-pagan nature religion may worship nature. It's part of what we are, and God is in it, just as God is in us. God is in everything. So that being the case, the relationship that you have with nature, as we call it, and by the way, nature is a modern term. No pre-modern society would have seen a separate thing called nature in that way. It's the same as we would have with, put it this way, G.K. Chesterton had this lovely phrase. He said, nature is not our mother, she's our sister, which I really like. So we should treat the rest of nature as we treat our sister. We should treat the forest as we might treat a member of our family. When you see that way, when you see that, you've got an understanding of creation which is not a so-called pagan understanding in which you worship the forest, but neither is it the modern rationalist understanding where you harvest the forest sustainably because everything's just a resource. And that's the way some Christian understandings have seen nature as well. We're in this modern catastrophe, which some Christians have played a part in, and we've all played a part in which we're just treating the rest of life as a resource that we can burn through. And that's a spiritual disaster as well as an ecological one. So coming to that understanding has had an effect on me, which is still going on. But I came to see that environmental activism is useful, but it's not good enough because it doesn't have a spiritual core to it. And that if we rediscover that sort of understanding of what creation is and how God has a relationship with it as well as with us, then we start to see something quite different. I'm not sure exactly how that plays out politically or practically or anything like that, but we can start to see how it plays out in us, I think. So that's sort of the journey I've been on.
Very good, thanks, Paul. And so something I mentioned to you just before we got together here was I had an interest in Wendell over the years. I thought he was a wonderful Christian writer about the same issues, and had seen your name in relation to Wendell in an edited volume of his work, and it was only later after the conversation with Joe on different things that it clicked. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. So I just want to ask a little bit about him. He's such a seminal figure for many Americans, but his writing for Christians more broadly is fantastic, I think. And he, like what you just described, understands the economia as this wider concept, understanding of the world, than the modern notion of economics as the kind of materialist underpinnings that you described. It's just stuff out there in the view of nature that we have to just grasp. I want to ask about, he has one about What Matters, talks about the Commonwealth and stewardship properly understood, I suppose, in contrast to the darker sides that you mentioned. Some Christians would say, we have to establish dominion over the land and things like that, so is that misreading of the scripture, whereas he helps clarify some of those issues and shows that we are to treat the rest of creation like you described. Would you like to speak to that and Wendell's importance and how he has maybe been a life for people in contrast to the myths?
Yeah, so Wendell Berry is an American farmer from Kentucky and a writer, novelist, and essayist and poet. He's written an intimidatingly large number of books over the last 50 years. Very interesting man. I always used to read Wendell Berry's essays when I was younger and as an activist, and I'd sort of skip the Christian ones. Now I'm most interested in them. Because Berry kind of wears his Christianity quite lightly, but it's right there at the heart of the way he treats the land. And he's a man who still, he doesn't anymore because he's in his 80s, but until quite recently he would plough his land with horses. He would do everything the old-fashioned way. He famously loved to have a computer. And he's not doing this out of bloody mindedness, he's doing it because he wants to understand how you can have, as a farmer, a relationship with the earth that treats the earth well, treats the animals well, and also gives you what you need from it, which is what stewardship is. Right? That's how it's supposed to work. And how it has worked in many traditional societies until the modern age. Not all of them, but many of them. He's written quite beautifully about this, actually, in a lot of different forms, and his essays are inspiring. I put a collection of them together for Penguin in Britain a few years back. They asked me to do that, and that's the first British collection of his essays I think that are out there. But he's a really good writer to read if you want to understand how you can take that Christian notion of stewardship of creation and apply it in the modern world. Of course, the modern world isn't going in Wendell Berry's direction, as he will openly admit. It's been going throughout his entire life in the other direction, which is industrialisation, the use of nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides and intensification and giant corporate farms and global trade and all the other stuff that we know about. And everything that he said about that has been borne out. Everything he said about the way that you have to treat the soil, everything that he said about the way that you have to treat the forests and the way that you have to treat your animals, and how you can live from the land well without destroying it. Common sense in a way, but the fact that it seems so countercultural shows how crazy the culture's gone. But he's an important writer, I think, and an influential one as well. I don't know who will sort of take up the baton after him, because he's also a product of his time and place. But it's that kind of exploration that I think is just important. And the thing that matters about Wendell Berry is that he gets his hands dirty. He's not just writing or talking, he's farming as well. So what he writes comes from an experience that he's had. So yeah, I think he's a writer you should explore if you haven't explored him. He's well worth reading.
Excellent, thanks Paul. And you'd be too humble to say it, but I think in many ways Paul's work is taking up the mantle from Wendell Berry, I would argue. And
I don't have a horse-drawn farm, unfortunately. I've got 2 acres. He's got about 200 acres, I've got 2 acres, so it's not quite there, but yeah.
No, but I want to ask you next, Paul, if I may, about so your story, I think, will resonate with people in part because many of us have gone through those different stages. We're drawn to Eastern spirituality. Even myself, I was drawn to Sanatana Dharma, probably known as Hinduism. It went through Sufi Islam. Jonathan Pajot, who you mentioned, was interested in one time with Sufi Islam. And I, one of the speakers that I had hoped that was going to be here today, coming from a more secularist background, and I have spoken about the distinctions between different worldviews, and I tried to convey to her what comes across in your work and in someone like Martin Shaw, that Christ fulfills these other traditions, other different pagan elements, different mythologies. It finds its place, it's lifted up in Christ, whereas there's this more antithetical model like Christ versus all of the... I kind of like tapping into what you said previously about the hero myth. In some ways it subverts the story, as Paul says, but it also fulfills it. I wonder if you might speak about that, and I suppose what comes across also when you're writing is how those elements that are in someone like Wendell Berry scale. So we have this wonderful Celtic Christian tradition which seems to have incorporated those pagan elements, and I wonder what you might say about that.
I was in Romania a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago actually, and I was on holiday with my family, and I was dragging my children around all these monasteries and churches while we were there, some of which we stayed in. And I went to visit this Orthodox monastery, and the monasteries in Romania are still very alive. We were given a tour of this monastery, and many of the monasteries in Romania are very, very much painted on the outside as well as on the inside, covered in iconography and frescoes and the rest of it. And we were being given a tour of this monastery by the abbot, and there's the church in the middle, and the church is covered in pictures, and most of them sort of Christ and the saints and biblical scenes and things. But then there's a group of people along the top of this church, bearded men, who look a bit like sort of ancient Romans or ancient Greeks, and they've all got crowns on. They haven't got any halos, they've got crowns on. And I said to the abbot, who are those men? And he said, oh, that's all the Greek philosophers. There's Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And I said, well, what are they doing on the Orthodox Christian church? And he said, oh, well, they're precursors, because they could see God. They didn't have Christ yet, but they could see elements of the truth, and they brought people along, and they built their sort of building blocks. And I thought that was really interesting, and Orthodoxy does that quite a lot. It synthesizes other ways of seeing and says, yeah, as you say, these lead up to and are sort of joined together by the coming of Christ, rather than being completely antithetical. And it's a very interesting, it's very Christian, it's traditional Christianity, there's no mush about it, they're not pretending everything's the same, and we can all be very ecumenical about it, but at the same time, there's elements of truth in all these other different traditions too that can be found. And as you say, people in the West are completely lost today, right? We have no idea what to do. I'm speaking for myself, but probably not just for myself. We have the same spiritual longing as everyone's always had everywhere, but we don't really have anything to do with it. And so, especially if you're a younger person, you certainly don't go to a church. I didn't, that's for sure. Most people don't go to a church. If they did want to go to a church, they wouldn't know which church to go to. Which one are you going to choose from? There's so many of them. Some of them might be from your cultural background, but maybe that one doesn't seem appealing. Maybe it seems wrong. Maybe it's, or maybe it's scandal-ridden, as churches are sometimes. So you think, oh, the church isn't got anything to say to me, so where do I go? Do I go to Hinduism? Do I go to Buddhism? Do I go to neo-paganism? Do I go into... There's a million things you can do, especially in the age of YouTube. You can find everything. And some of them, lots of them have things in them that are real. I've practiced Zen Buddhism for quite a number of years, and there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of practice in that is actually really very useful, especially about the nature of the self and how you can understand the nature of the self. But for me, it didn't lead me to the truth until I found the Orthodox Church. But this is what we do. We scatter all over the place because we're looking for something. Everyone's got the spiritual urge, but they don't know where to go. And so, I'm slightly losing the thread of where that's leading me. Because I don't really know what the answer to the question is. But it's the journey of the modern Western person in a society that doesn't have a spiritual centre. We don't have a story that we can tell about what God is, what the sacred is, what the truth is. We don't believe in anything except money. We don't believe in anything except growth, and we don't even really believe in that, but we just keep saying it because we haven't got anything else to say, so we just say growth and progress, and we hope that it'll sort itself out somehow. So we're right in the middle of a spiritual crisis. But that's exciting, because a spiritual crisis is, that actually creates, it creates some sort of explosion, it creates some fissile material. If you're in a spiritual crisis in a dead, nihilistic culture, then it's going to take you somewhere, which I think is maybe what's happening to a lot of people, including me. So I think that's where we are. Yeah, so I don't know how, as a Christian, you're supposed to speak to people about that. But we're just hearing from Paul about one way to do it. But maybe it's enough just to be there. To know, just to be following the path. I don't know.
Thanks, Paul. And one other area that I thought was most helpful with your work, and it reminded me of people like Illich, that I really admire, is this notion of apocalypse as unveiling. I wonder if you might speak to that and how some recent events, like you said there about crisis, is also the deepest crisis is the greatest opportunity. Oftentimes, it seems to be. We were talking at lunch about the rise and fall of history, how you can't read very easily God's providence in history, and how these great times of crisis, say before the French Revolution, or at the French Revolution, for example, you might think all is lost, then you have this revival elsewhere. Could you speak to that understanding of apocalypse and how it might help us understand the modern crisis of environment and so on?
Yeah, I have a bit of a soft spot for apocalypse. It's probably a weakness of mine. I've been writing about it for years because I think we're in one. And yeah, obviously the meaning of apocalypsis in Greek means unveiling. It doesn't mean end of the world, it means something is revealed. So the apocalypse of John is the revelation of John literally is what John sees and what he lays out before us. So I think we're deeply in an apocalyptic time. I wrote a few essays about the COVID moment especially, and the authoritarianism that arose around COVID. As a deeply apocalyptic event, because suddenly you could see who had the power and who was prepared to use it, and who was prepared to say what and what we were prepared to do and not do. And whatever your opinions about that was a deeply apocalyptic moment, I think, for Western culture, because we saw a load of stuff that had been hidden before. So in an apocalyptic time, things come out to the surface that were always there. And we're in that all the time. Everything that seems to be apocalyptic now. Politics is apocalyptic, climate change is apocalyptic, COVID is apocalyptic. Ukraine is apocalyptic. All of this stuff is revealing all these undercurrents in society that it was easier to hide before. And that, again, is useful, actually. It's necessary, it happens. I just keep coming to the conclusion again and again, the more I talk and the more I travel and think about these things, that these things are necessary. As I say, I was in Romania and I was talking to people there about some of the hideous things that happened to Christians under the communist regime. The Romanian communist regime was in some ways even worse than the Russian one. The Securitate in Romania were even worse than the KGB in terms of the things they would do to people who were dissidents. And they did it a lot to Christians. And they have this whole series of saints they call the saints of the prisons, who were tortured and who still ministered in jail, and this terrible stuff happened. And somebody told me about one of the saints who, back in the 1950s, at the height of communist repression in Romania, he said, communism is terrible, but what comes after is going to be worse. Okay? And people said, what are you talking about? What could be worse than this? And what he meant was, what it turned out he meant was, what's going to come after this state repression is going to be a different kind of thing. It's going to be temptation instead. So what you have instead of the obvious violent abuse by force of Christians, which actually can create strong Christianity as it did in the early church, you're going to get just the temptations of your screens and your plenty and your cars and your globalisation and your cheap coffee and all the stuff. And that's actually, in a way, far more likely to drag you away, tempt you away from God, from the spiritual life, than persecution. Some people anyway, because with persecution you know where you stand. And if you believe, you have to stand there. And I mean, who knows what any of us would do if that happened. But the stakes are clear. They're not very clear now, are they? Because everything that's sold to us that actually rots our souls is sold to us as a good thing. And it's tempting and it's fun. And you can spend hours on it. You can look at your screen and you can do this, that and the other. So the temptation is kind of it's a difficult spiritual crisis to deal with. But I think you have to identify it. So I see that as the kind of the digital snake in the garden is the thing at the moment that's dragging us away from what we should be doing. So yeah, but I'm still writing on the internet. So that's the trap. It's very difficult. How do you even live without it now? Try it. It's very hard.
Yeah, that's another thing that I've been thinking about in relation to what we're doing. Obviously, with me having a YouTube channel and everything too, is how, again, channeling Illich, how do we live this convivial life where things are at the right kind of scale, balance, so that we don't get taken over by the machine, as it were. I wonder what you might say about that. And then I suppose maybe to ground it for people, if you would maybe share a few of your experiences from your recent trip to Romania, and you're just back from Mount Athos, and seeing that living Christian culture, I suppose, in contrast to the kind of comfort, affluent kind of banality that you described before. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What was the first question you asked there? There were three. What was the first one? You just you said something and then you asked me about Athos.
Oh, about conviviality.
That was it, Illich. Yeah. So even Illich, if you haven't come across him, is a very interesting Catholic writer, actually, although quite a heterodox Catholic writer. He wrote a lot about technology many years ago, back in the 70s, really. Wrote a very good book called The Convivial Society. He wrote a lot about the dangers of technocracy. This is long before the internet, obviously. Another writer who did the same thing is Ellul, who's also a Christian, not sure what kind of Christian he was, but he wrote a very good book called The Technological Society. And a few other shorter books about Christianity, actually, which were quite interestingly subversive. And so you've got writers like them and Wendell and a few other Western Christian writers who really engage with the threat of technology, the threat of digital technology particularly. When I say technology, I don't mean, an axe. I don't even mean a car, although that is destructive. I mean, particularly at the moment, this huge matrix of digital technologies which are winding themselves around us and bringing us into the metaverse and leading us towards the internet of bodies and the internet of things where everything's connected to everything else. And the idea is that very, very soon there'll be no distinction between reality and the metaverse. So that's where we're headed. And that's pretty demonic stuff, if you ask me. So we have to decide where we're going to stand on that. And people like Illich and Ellul and Berry and others are really good guides to this. Really good. There's some really smart commentary there. There's not enough awareness in society as a whole about exactly where this stuff is taking us. And we just think it's fun and it's entertaining and we can't do without it. But it's a lot more than that. So we have to get smart about it, I think. In terms of, I went to, as I say, I went to Romania in July, and then I went to Mount Athos last week. I've been making a few Orthodox pilgrimages this year. Mount Athos, for those of you who don't know it, is a 1,000-year-old monastic republic in Greece. It's a peninsula in Greece. It's inhabited only by monks. 20 monasteries, lots of cells, lots of hermits in the mountains. And so I spent 5 days there. And so I'm still sort of processing that. But there's what you see there is interestingly a living Christian tradition. A lot of very young monks as well. Nothing like we have here in the West, where the monasteries are either gone, like they are in my country for 500 years, or sort of dying out as they appear to be here, certainly. There's something strong still going on. And actually, in a lot of the monasteries in Mount Athos, there's been a revival. 30 years ago, there would be hardly any monks in one of the monasteries, and now there's 200 of them. So something's going on in Eastern Orthodoxy, which is not to romanticise it. It's got plenty of its own problems, and it's full of human corruption, like everything else is. But nevertheless, there's something going on. which I am increasingly interested in learning from, because I can see the same spirit in the best bits of the Orthodox Church as I might see in the lives of the Desert Fathers, or I might see in the early church in Ireland, which was basically a monastic island, was a sort of monastic island for hundreds of years. There were 3,000 Irish saints generated in the first 500 years of Christianity. It was incredible. You can't walk 5 yards in Ireland without bumping into some ancient Christian monument. So that spirit's still alive, and I think in this age where digital technology is enveloping us with all the values that it has, some form of kind of radical ascesis, the spirit of the Desert Fathers, or what they used to call the Green Martyrdom here in Ireland. They call it the Green Martyrdom. They used to try and copy the lives of the Desert Fathers, who went off into the Egyptian desert to live in the tombs and pray and live a radical ascetic life. And they went off to Skellig Michael and into the forests and out to the islands and all of the lakes here. And they call it the Green Martyrdom, which is a great phrase. So there's something about the spirit of that really interests me in terms of rediscovering a kind of a Christian response to what's happening. Because I think what's happening is quite dark in a lot of ways, and you need to think about what's going on. So that's how I'm sort of fumbling around in that area at the moment, I think.
Thank you, Paul. And then just a final question before I open it up to question and answers is, I wonder, as someone like yourself who, as we saw with the last talk that we had here, you have this community building around you, the community around your Substack is developing. I wonder how you see the importance of those institutions kind of parallel to what Paul is doing with the S3 groups, all that wonderful stuff. How do you see, is that developing organically, or what would you like to see happen that we might have greater communal spirit and get back to these proper embodied communities?
Yeah, I don't know whether you can have a community on the internet. I think you can have a bunch of readers on the internet. I mean, you sort of can have a virtual community, can't you? But it's not really a community unless it communes, unless it actually gets together in the real world. So you can have a lot of good conversations, I think, with people all over the place. And I'm lucky enough to have a really smart collection of readers, actually. I don't know where they all come from. They're all from all over the place, but it's, there's a hunger for meaning, as you were just discussing, and so when you try writing about these issues, people come, which is really good. I don't know what constitutes a community. The next step then, as you were both talking about as well, is how you translate that into meat space, as I believe they call it on the internet. Meat space, that's reality to the rest of us. There you go, I told you we were in trouble. Meat space. So we're in meat space now. So ME80, by the way, ME80. It's charming, isn't it? So, I mean, it's descriptive, but yeah. So meat space, how that manifests, and that's the challenge, because it's easy to have the conversation on the internet, and really valuable often as well. And I like to watch good videos and read good things all the time, and I'm happy that people read mine and pull me up on things I've got wrong as well. But then, yeah, what do you do with that? How do you take it out? But that's happening too. It's happening all over the place. People form meet-up groups, sometimes with local people, based on other things they've read in groups they're around and stuff. But that's the challenge now. That's the challenge. I think probably the Amish have got it right, although they can't. They can't read my Substack, but which is not a disadvantage really, if you think about it. But I mean, I'm serious. That's that kind of critical, intelligent attitude to technology and roots in land and a kind of spiritual core to it. I mean, it's not a life most of us can live, but it's I'd put a bit of money on the Amish being around in 500 years, but I'm not sure the rest of consumer society will be there. So we'll see. We'll see. But that's the challenge. It's like, how do you meet people in world where you can increasingly, especially with the situation we had around COVID and the kind of cultural divisiveness and all the stuff that's going on there, half the challenge is just finding people who you can talk to about things you actually believe in, without being condemned by everybody else for wrong thinking. So actually just being able to get together with people in a place and have those conversations is just a valuable thing, and then it can go in all sorts of directions. So yeah. So these kind of online spaces could be a jumping off point for that, I think.
Thank you, Paul, and hopefully that's what we're starting today. We're going to talk about more later about setting up an estuary group in Ireland, for example. I'll have to see if anyone's interested in that. So just to ask, does anyone have any questions based on what we just described then? Peter, I'll start with yourself.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question, but first of all, preface it with both things. Desert Martin is a town that was in a hermitage that was in the middle of a huge forest here 1,000 years ago, north of here. And that's where the word desert came into the Irish language, literally from the desert as we know today, all that sand. It now means in Irish a hermitage. So we have a place called Dashart or Desert, that means a hermitage was set up there, and this was set up in the middle of a huge oak forest that was later cut down in the 1600s to build the Royal Navy. But you have that in Irish, but the thing that intrigues me the most is something that you haven't really alluded to yet, is what happens in terms of the understanding of authority coming from the ground up, that people have authority, and now it's been abused with what I call the Sovietization of society as a result of the lockdowns and the virus, that people are now, in churches even, are using not authority but power, just blunt force of power to dictate things to go through. And I find that happening. I'm talking about certain things even in my own church, the Catholic Church, you know, that in essence no longer people are sort of understanding the historical role of authority. Have you addressed that in your website or in your history today? Sorry, I didn't know about your website at all. I haven't never looked at it, so forgive me for that.
Well, I'm shocked.
Sorry.
Well, at least you had the honesty to admit that. So, I haven't. I mean, it's an interesting question, and I didn't know about Dysart, by the way, because that's really interesting. Because I have seen that word in various places.
D-Y-S-E.
Yeah, I've seen it, and I didn't know that. So thank you.
But St. Augustine in his book City of God addresses that there. He calls it the libido dominandi, which is the lust to dominate. The actual fact is called the gerund in Latin.
Yeah, totally.
It means lust to be dominated.
Well, I mean, I haven't written anything about this. I've written plenty about COVID and the authoritarianism around it. I haven't written about the church specifically. But no, I mean, it was astonishing to see the churches just shutting themselves down for 2 years. And just saying, right, okay, no communion then because the government says. I mean, that didn't happen during the Black Death, you know, and it happened during this, which was not comparable to the Black Death, in case you hadn't noticed. You know, astonishing. But there was no pushback. I mean, I'd say there were some priests and there were some, you know, I don't know if there was a bishop maybe. There were some priests who said, no, I'm going to keep doing this. You know, the Archbishop of Canterbury back in England is giving the Easter communion from his kitchen table, I think, wasn't he? Online. And I saw recently they took all their services online in the Church of England, and then their marketing department put out a tweet on the anniversary, and they said, we've taken all of our services online for a year and we've loved every minute of it. And I just think, oh good, that's great, that's the Church of England now, that's the Church of Augustine of Canterbury. There you go. But yeah, the sort of the lack of a squeak from any of the established churches actually about this was just appalling, actually. I think it was just disgraceful. Yeah, I mean, some of the Orthodox churches sort of got around it in various ways, and some of them didn't. But there was, you know, it's interesting. I went to Romania, which is one of the least vaccinated countries in Europe, and I'm not particularly expressing an opinion about the vaccine or whatever, but hardly anyone's been vaccinated there. And so I said to them, people I was with, I said, why is that then? Is it anything to do with the religion, or what is it? And they said, no, just nobody trusts the state here, right? Because we had 70 years of communist abuse. And then they said before that we had like 1,000 years of like either being invaded or colonised or incompetent kings or savage kings, and then we had communists who abused everybody. So we don't trust the state. So we, you know, and it's a very different attitude to the West, especially Ireland, which seems to trust the state completely for some reason. They just go, I'm not doing that. I'm not injecting myself with that because you said so, so I'm not doing it. And so they find ways around it. Now, you could debate whether that's a good or a bad thing. But in terms of groundswell of popular opinion, I think it's a very good thing because it means that you're much less likely to be abused. And again, it's because they went through the kind of the fire of persecution in Romania that they're not stupid about what the state is capable of and what power is capable of, not just the state, but power generally. Whereas we are a bit naive about that here, because we haven't been persecuted for a while. I mean, the Irish have been persecuted more recently than the English, certainly, but, you know, still, we've had a lot of comfort for a while, right? So nobody is, there's a certain, I don't know what it is, there's a naivety to it, but yeah, no, I thought that it was just amazing that happened. it was one of those things that was revealed. It was one of those apocalyptic things that the church is here. We're just going to go, okay, right, we'll just shut down operations for as long as you say. It was amazing. So yeah, I know. Look, yeah, that's how I felt about that.
Thanks, Paul. And yourself, Bob?
Yeah, but isn't that issue there that we're talking about, the fact that there's no pushback from the church and so on, isn't it really due to the fact that they have lost moral authority over the years? But more than that, there is now a trust deficit as far as the church is concerned. And in a sense, what we're doing here together is trying to find a pathway towards a new trust contract, if you like, with the idea of Christianity, the church and so on. Because I think that's the nub of the whole thing, that moral authority was lost because of the behaviour that went on within the church, scandals and so on, all credibility gone, and then with it, the baby and the bathwater. So now our job, collectively, if we see any value in sort of the myth around religion and so on, to try and find a pathway to trust again.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm not Catholic, I'm not Irish either, but you know, but I'm aware of everything that's happened. So yeah. So then the question for the Catholic Church, I suppose, is, you know, what's the church going to do to regain that? And it doesn't seem to have an idea, because it just seems to be flailing around, understandably, probably deservedly as well. So yeah, I think maybe, well, probably, definitely, I would say that any rejuvenation will have to come from the ground, won't it? You know, it will have to come from people, lay people, probably, rather than bishops or whatever. It's going to have to. You know, what's the point of a church? You know, what's the point of Christianity? What are we doing here? You know, and it's something that interests me about the early churches. The early church for quite a long time didn't do any missionary work after St. Paul. And there are those who say that between St. Paul and St. Patrick there wasn't much mission going on. There certainly wasn't much official stuff, but the church was growing quite fast. And one of the reasons seems to be that was the way Christians were living. The way that they were helping others, and the way that they seemed to be joyful, and the way that even when they were being fed to lions, they were, you know, embracing each other and singing. And there was something really weirdly countercultural and attractive about this life, especially in pagan Rome, which was pretty barbaric in many ways and very hierarchical. And it was, you know, if you were down at the bottom of the pile, you were mostly in trouble. Nietzsche said Christianity was a religion for slaves and women, which it was. He said it was a compliment, not being what he thought it was. And you know, it was attractive. So we probably need to be attractive. You know, we need to live like Christians and be attractive.
Look at the Christians, how they love one another.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's the hard. But on the other hand, of course, you've got what C.S. Lewis said, which is that it's much harder to, you know, it's easier to convert a pagan to Christianity than it is to convert a post-Christian atheist or secularist to Christianity, or indeed anything, right? Because we're almost the first society that's ever existed that hasn't had a sense of the existence of a spiritual realm. Whereas you might be a follower of the Roman gods, you might be a follower of the Viking gods. Well, you know there are gods, right? You know there's a spiritual realm. You might then be conversant to a discussion about Christ, and you might go, okay, this is the real deal, and then you might become a Christian. Whereas now you've got to convince people that there is anything at all beyond the material realm. And then you've got to convince people that all their ideas about Christianity might be wrong, or at least some of them, and it might still have something to offer. So it's a harder sell. So I think that my personal view, just my personal view, and I'm very new, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but is that we just have to embody it rather than trying to sell it to anybody. You know, nobody ever tried to sell Christianity to me. In fact, when I went to the Orthodox Church for the first time, I met this priest, and I said to him, you know, I'm quite interested in Orthodoxy, and he said, yeah, take your time. Right? He said, look, you know, he said, you know, the devil will want to have his way with you. He said, take your time, you know, just, he gave me a few things I could do, and he said, you know, keep coming back to the liturgy. He said, but, you know, take your time. He said, don't expect everyone here to be a saint. Just, you know, he didn't try and get me in and go, oh, brilliant, we'll baptise you, and then I can add you to my numbers. It was like, yeah, you know, let's just see what the Spirit wants to do. And especially as I'm a Western guy in the Romanian church, you know, don't go rushing it. And that was one of the things that attracted me. One of the things that made me go back. Was that he was just like, well, here we are. This is what we do. We're not going to try and sell it to you. I'm going to tell you about it because you asked, and then I'll help you if you need help. But you know, if he tried to evangelise me, I probably would have run away, because we don't like that. I don't like being lecture by Christians, even now I'm a Christian, so it's unattractive. So, but what is attractive is people living as Christians, isn't it? Because we don't see that much. And if it's radically countercultural now as well to do that. So that's I'm not advertising myself as that, by the way, because if I could end up at any point in my life actually living that way, it would be a worthwhile thing. So I think maybe I have a hunch that that's the work. Yeah. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Yourself? Yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about Wendell Berry and his emphasis on localism? And I think there's a connection there with living an attractive life, especially in the context that so many of us find ourselves in. I live in Dublin, a very urban position, and yet you look around and you see people that are completely cut off from locality, from place, that are, to do anything, they have to engage with this kind of monstrous globalist machine, just to get the food that they need to survive, delivered to their doorstep, and kind of the intersection between that and localism and how Christians can engage with that as part of an attractive life.
Yeah, well, it's one of Wendell Berry's key things. The key themes he comes back to again and again and again is local economy, especially, and how local economy creates local culture. How if you have a landscape made up of local farms run by the people who own them, who are selling their food to the people, then you have a culture already, and you have more agency as well, because to some degree you have control over your food and influence over your food. Of course, it means you don't get to have the degree of luxury that we have now. You can't eat food imported from all over the world at any time of year, but it's absolutely central to his vision, which is a Christian vision, but also a farmer's vision and a localist vision. And it doesn't have to just be a rural vision either. I mean, this is how cities were set up until not so long ago, actually. I mean, even in London, they would have, there were chickens in people's backyards and there were herds of cows. Until they had the railway in London, they used to have urban farms with urban cows, because you couldn't import the milk from the countryside because it would go off. So the cows would be in the city and they would herd them down the street, and then they would milk them, and then people would come get the milk. Until the railways came, and then you could bring the milk in from elsewhere, so that all disappeared. But even the cities were self-sufficient in that way. And once you've eliminated all of that localism, the local economy, which is really pretty much what the global economy is designed to do, what the EU is designed to do, and the World Trade Organization, they're designed to eliminate locality and local power and replace it with giant trading networks run by corporations. Then your agency's gone, and like you say, then you have to engage with these enormous faceless systems all the time just to get anything done at all, which is now the way we have to live, almost always. I mean, you can't phone your bank anymore, you can't communicate with anyone on the phone, you barely find in Ireland it's a little bit different, but it's harder to find a local trader and the rest of it. So that localism is at the heart of it, because local economic power gives you local political power, gives you local relationship to your land, and and as I said, everything over the last 50 years has been going in the opposite direction, of course. But it's still a vision that I cleave to as a really important one. The more local power you have, the more local economic power you have, then the more agency you have, which is why we don't have any. We're not supposed to have agency. We're supposed to just buy things. But yeah, it's absolutely central to the vision, and it's an attractive part of it for me.
Thanks, Paul. Do one more question. Let's take one from this side. Yeah.
First of all, delighted to hear you say Jacques Ellul, because I feel like always screaming at the screen when I'm listening to you like this. Clearly this guy knows Jacques Ellul. But anyway, I just want to know how you think about because he had this concept of technique, and that's like a really huge overarching sort of concept that runs for millennia. It's kind of like this, it's almost like this form of consciousness or whatever. I'm also reading Nadler's Shadow in the Shadow of the Machine. He talks about techne and stuff like that. And he sort of frames it as this mode of consciousness that sort of took the gods out of the world, so to speak, and it was that led humanity to kind of tinker in this kind of way. And Ellul sort of makes the point that it's like a new covenant, it's like a post-fall sort of idea for Ellul, where we've sort of, it's like post-Edenic kind of state. So I wonder how you think about these things in the broad sweep, and maybe what's been added, say, to those ideas that make it, that constitute your idea of the machine, or what's different about that, or
Yeah, I don't know how different it is, and I'm not as, I'm not Jacques Ellul, I don't have that massive depth of learning and over a lifetime, but there's something about Jacques Ellul, even Illich, even pro-technology Silicon Valley writers like Kevin Kelly, who wrote this great book called What Technology Wants, which is really good if you want to understand what's going on in Silicon Valley. They have this notion that machine consciousness, what Jacques Ellul calls technique, is something that, as you say, it's almost as if it's in the ether, and you can tap into it. And at different stages, civilizations rise and fall based on how much they've tapped into it, right? So the story of the Tower of Babel is a myth based on us tapping into that technique and deciding we're going to build up to the sky and we're going to create this giant thing. And then, of course, it gets knocked down because that's what always happens. Cain is the father of technological civilization. That's the way I see it. I mean, I love the myth of the fall. I love the myth of the garden all the time because I go back to it again and again. There's always something more I need to find in it. Because at the beginning, the story tells us that everything's in communion with everything else. So we're in this garden. We're walking around in this garden. God's walking around as well, right? So you can see God. So you're that close to the source of being that you can see it. And everything else is there, and everything's in harmony with everything else. Nature isn't afraid of us. Nothing else is afraid of us. We're not afraid of it. We're all naked. We're revealed. Everything's revealed to everything else in this place. But we have our choice, and the choice we have is whether we're going to take the fruit of knowledge. And when we take the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, then we're ejected from that. Or it's not even that we're rejected, it's that that's the consequence, right? So God says, well, you can eat that if you want, but here's the consequence. You have to leave, which means you have to leave the communion. You have to leave your connection with everything else, and you have to be in your individual self, and you have to become self-aware, and you say, oh no, I'm naked, I must make clothes, which is maybe the first technology. You start covering yourself with clothes, and then you get the first murder, and then there's Cain, and then there's Tubal-Cain, who is Cain's grandson, I think, who's the first smith. So Tubal-Cain is probably the founder of technological civilization. It all goes from there, and because we chose knowledge, we embrace technology to try and create or recreate the world that we left. We're actually trying to get back to the garden all the time. So we try and create, you could say that farming is that. You could say that almost all of our technological reaching, they're trying to get us back into that union, that unity. And you can't get to it that way. But then you look at the way that the Silicon Valley guys sell you the metaverse. I've had conversations with some of these people, and they say, oh, it's going to be great when we get, what we need to do is we need to start again because nature's imperfect, right? There's too much death and there's too much misery and injustice. So we're going to rebuild nature, and we're going to upload our minds to the cloud so we can live forever, and there's going to be peace and justice. And it's basically a Christian story. Right? It comes out of Silicon Valley. It comes from a Puritan Christian culture, right? It's a Christian story, but it's technological. So they're trying to create a technological heaven, a technological kingdom, but it's not controlled by God, it's controlled by us. And we get to live forever in the cloud. Everything's perfect. There's no injustice. Nature is rebuilt at our convenience, so it suits us. But it's also the devil's work, right? I mean, it's the devil's offer. It's like, hey, God just wants to hold you back. So, eat this apple and you can be the master. So technology, the way that we're using technology to rebuild the world in our image is what the serpent offered right at the beginning. That's the way it seems to me. It's that offer again. And we keep trying, and it's the Tower of Babel, it's the digital Tower of Babel we're building now. And it's going to have the same fate, I think. So we're endlessly trying to build our way back to the garden with our own hands, with our own devices. Because the alternative is humbling yourself and following the way of Christ, which is less pleasant, right? At least it requires you to bow your head to something bigger than you rather than pretending to be God yourself. So in a way, what is happening is radically new, and in another way, it's the same old story. That's how it seems to be.
I just thought it was funny because you said it's not an axe.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, if you think about it, if you go back far enough,
you can take it back that far.
Yeah.
I mean, in that sense, anything that you use a tool is a technology. Language is a technology. Fire at the axe, that's a hard sell. But it's true. It's absolutely, and that's why the story of Eden, the story of the fall, is so interesting. Again and again and again, it tells us something so fundamental, I think, about our relationship with creation and creator. That's how I see it, anyway.
Thanks, Paul. I think that'll do for the questions for now. We can think about that over dinner or lunch, or whatever you want to call it. and build upon that later on. So Siobhan in the cafe, she is ready for us at 4:30. So then if we do dinner from 4:30 to 5:30 approximately, then come back in here and bring two gents together, and after that then we can do some group work for those who are interested, really flesh out some of these ideas that we've been discussing today. So at that I just want to say thank you, Paul, and yeah, go get a bit of fresh air. We'll have dinner soon. I'll find out, I think maybe because of the rain we may be in the big hall, which is just down here to the right, but I'll check that now in a second. Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you guys for your great questions too.
Thanks.